Welcome to January 5th, as if the year wasn't already 2023. I'm sure you're all making that mistake. You're still writing 2022, but it's 2023. Welcome to the MSP Initiative Live. We bring back a special guest today, Reed Warren, that fits perfectly in a nice series of sessions we've done recently. We had service leadership on. We had Dennis from Taylor Business Group, and voila, Reed Warren himself. So before we get into the good stuff, MSPinitiative.com. We are about to make it all nice, pretty informal, but we are running 2 in-person events this year in other than, the crazy parties, which always happen and have a mind of their own. We'll get to them a little bit later. We have 2 in-person events this year, one in Denver, one in Dallas. And we're going to call that the MSP Community Minds event. We're going to bring experts, maybe like Reed Warren, I'll talk to him after this, to come in, give you like a theme, right? A theory, right? And like every breakout session you've ever been to, and you always walk out with like, bullet points that 6 months later you've done absolutely nothing with. So we're going to set it up. We're going to bring in experts from all corners of the industry, and they're going to actually give you more than zero. What does that mean? I'm not trying to knock anyone. I want people to go into a workshop and come out with something in their hand. Okay. So like, for example, if I were to bring somebody in like a Reed Warren, he's going to come in and say, I've done so many of these transactions, like on both sides of the aisle. You need to make sure that you're doing A, B, and C, whether it be in your accounting practices, whether it be in the way you're organizing your company, whether it be in some sort of process or workflow you're not currently doing. And at the end of whatever this is, you're going to walk out and say, I'm going to make sure that whether I'm selling tomorrow or I'm going to borrow money from the bank, I'm ready to go.
I think it's great.
That's a tangible thing that you can walk out with, rather than, again, I'm not trying to knock every event you've ever been to, but man, I've been to so many breakout sessions. I literally go like year over year, like dump the box out, and I have all these notes that I've taken from breakout sessions. I've done absolutely nothing. So like, we're going to get past just the presentation and the projector screen. We're going to get into something you can walk out with the idea that now that you've gotten to not ground zero, the next rung, right? Level 1, right? Outside of the ground floor, that you'll actually have something you can build on top of rather than nothing. And by the way, no offense to anybody who's ever been, tapped on the shoulder to do a breakout session, but it's like, hey, you ought to think about, or you should look into, or do some research in, and none of those things never happen. I'm sorry, but they just don't. So MSP Community Minds, that's what we're calling it. 2 live, like kind of 2-day in-person events, Denver, Dallas this year. We're going to give this, kind of a go. I've already talked to a few people. You're going to love these people. You've, have probably heard of some of these people. Maybe you haven't heard of others, but Reed's going to be one of those people that I'll talk to after this session. And like, I want you guys to realize that there is help out there, and it's not always a pay for play scheme. I promise you. Okay. People out there actually want to help you. This is a chance for you to get a lot of those people in one place and walk away with hopefully some pretty good results. So there's my intro. You're going to see that stuff popping up soon. I think the good people over at Channel Program, we're involved in something, I think, on next week, where they kind of bring people in to talk about the events for, 2023. I guess we're going to be included in there, but don't worry. I'm loud. You'll hear about it. All good.
And you got me hanging in suspense now. Any ideas around the dates on that? Or are you going to keep that like always hanging in suspense?
No, I do have dates. Hold on. I'll give you the dates right now, just so that you can pencil them into your calendar, Reed, and be available. Hold on one second.
Hey, I'm here for you. No, but I love that while you're looking that up. I mean, I really love what you're doing there, because
So
truly you go to a lot of sessions that end up being just a lot of, hey, that's kind of nice. And then you kind of go, man, what was it that I got out of that? And then really being able to have clear takeaways, I think, is absolutely critical, because you need to transform your business.
My hope is that people walk away with expert help. Not that they couldn't get it on their own, but like, I want you to get past the front brochure of whatever you're looking at and like walk away with the beginning of something, right? It probably means you're going to need to walk away after the 2 days and do more. But man, just like all this chat GPT stuff and all this stuff we're hearing about, it's like, I'm working backwards, right? I'm like kind of revising something in front of me rather than starting with absolutely nothing. This is what we're trying to do. But like with human beings instead of AI, I don't know. I'm a human being guy. I'm not saying the AI can't have value, but I digress. So since you asked, Reed, it is Dallas, May 8th and 9, and it's going to be Denver, August 14 and 15. Those are the two-day in-person. We've got to change up the game.
All right. Sounds good.
There it is. Maybe Matthew Fox will come out of his New York City shenanigans and get some different color M&Ms than the ones I already own.
I'll come out of the Fox's den for anything except for red number 2 M&M.
The Fox's den. Wow, that was good. I like that. I like that. All right. So Reed, we had Peter on from Service Leadership.
Yes.
Smart guy.
Great guy. Good guy.
He has
I like
his
Peter.
numbers down, man. He has his pencil sharpened. We went through all sorts of like what's best in class, what's middle of the road, what's failing. Unfortunately, what's failing seems to be a larger number than I thought. We had Dennis on from Taylor Business Group. We started talking about some of the stuff that they do, like they do different benchmarking and service leadership. And they sent me some stuff after the session, and we'll have them on again later to talk about some of the things that they kind of harp on to help people make sure that their stuff is in a good place, because they and their groups see a lot of, some of the stuff we're about to talk about, which is, hey, your books aren't quite right. We're gonna have to charge some stuff back to you. A lot of explanations that need to be made that probably could be avoided, if you do things in a certain way. And like, hey, what's the benefit of like learning from other people in the trench rather than you having to like, learn the hard way every single time. So we've talked about a ton of topics, on MSP Initiative. And I think this is like your third or fourth time, talking with us here. And I'll tell you, this M&A thing doesn't go away. Both sides, right? Buy and sell. It's never going to go away. I think it may be a little bit more, and I think Peter kind of highlighted this on his call when he was on with us from Service Leadership. It may be a little bit, over amplified, right? Like if you look at the number of transactions happening per year versus the total available people that are, in this, kind of line of business, it's like this, right? Rather than this, but it does set, kind of like some expectations that everybody should be doing, even if you're not in the mode, right? Even if you're not in the place today where you're like, I'm going to buy or I'm going to sell. If you run your business a certain way, no matter what you do, even if it's going out to borrow money, you're going to be in a better place than if you're kind of winging it, right?
Yes. Agreed. Absolutely agreed.
Most
people don't think about it until they're got ready to sell, and then it's kind of too late to start thinking about it. You need to think about it well in advance of that. And
100%.
And one of the things you're touching on, and I speak at the Evolve groups. I speak at the Taylor Business Groups. I've done some work within oh, come on, now I'm named. So certainly with Robin Robbins, but I was thinking of Gary Pica's groups and True Methods. There you go. I was having a senior moment there at 55. Hopefully it doesn't happen too often. But anyways, the point of that, I mean, all of those have different kind of emphasis, and I really love them. I think the main thing that if I were to have a general comment about all of them, there's two groups of people that go to them. One who really kind of just want group therapy and self-help and don't get a whole lot out of it. And then there's others that are, hey, really take it seriously and really take advantage of what that group has to offer, or that peer group. And I would just say Taylor Business Group's done a great job with their RTP program. It's really financially driven more than what I would say service leadership is. Although service leadership looks at a lot of numbers, certainly, and probably is the best, what I would consider operational feedback that you get on how to, from a delivery perspective and cost perspective on how to run the business. But I would say True Methods does a great job. Robin Robbins is far more sales and marketing, obviously driven on those pieces. And I'm not here to weigh one against the other than to say people go to them for different purposes based upon the needs that they see within the group. But I would say there's only about 10 to maybe 20% of people in those peer groups who really maximize what that group has to offer. And I would just tell you, a lot of people I get, because as I speak in those, there's a lot of people that are just kind of there riding along, thinking it's just going to somehow magically carry them to the promised land. It isn't. You got to actually roll up your sleeves. You actually got to do the work. But to your point, Gary, as you're talking about, any of these things, if you're a top quartile firm, however is defined in any one of those groups, you're doing a lot of the right things. And when you look at, having your financials in order, yes, you need to have your financials in order for a transaction, but you need your financials in order if you need to get a loan. The clearer your financials are, the better you're going to be to be able to sell or to have any sort of transaction, especially if you need to borrow money to go do acquisitions some way or other. If you're going to go through acquisition or sell the business, you have to have that stuff in order. And it's a lot of work. We get into it. We're in the middle of a project right now. Great company, interested in selling. We started with them in September, and we dug into the numbers, and their numbers just don't tell the story of the business. And so there's just a lot of stuff where it's like, oh, we moved money from this category to that category, and it's like, well, that wasn't wrong. It just, now it creates this erroneous kind of anomalous message within your financials. And just, it's really clear to have consistency through all that. The other thing I would say, whether you're using service leadership or you're using RTP or the other tools that are different out there, those are not industry standards. So in other words, they're recognized within that community, but QuickBooks is an industry standard. And so a lot of people say, hey, well, just take my service leadership report or take my, RTP report that I get from Taylor Business Group. Doesn't that tell the story? And it's like, not really. It's good for comparative analysis. It's good to help you get in place, but the bank doesn't know what to do with RTP or service leadership. They're like, that's a bunch of analysis. I need to see it in your QuickBooks file, right? And so being able to transfer that information in a meaningful way out of ConnectWise, out of any of the tools that you're having into QuickBooks, and be able to show a clear financial story within your financials through QuickBooks is really absolutely critical.
And I think part of the messaging to anyone is it needs to be a consistent over probably more than a year, right? Sometimes
Yes.
it takes 2 or 3 years of, I've heard the words clean financials, right? So like if you're, like I know everybody, like when they first start their business, they call up the local CPA or whoever the accountant is in the area, and like they don't necessarily know this specific industry, right? They just know how to make sure that you're ready for tax time. So I think it would be a good idea now at the beginning of 2023. And I have some assets. I'm sure Reed has some, and maybe we can consolidate these and put these out there for people to understand. There is a way to get your systems and books and profit and loss charts and balance sheets and like categorizations all in such a way that you're in your best possible place rather than leaving it open for people to just assume certain things. And I think that's the problem, right? Financial people who are doing things like underwriting or behind the scenes at the bank or whoever, they kind of have a little bit of liberty. And if you leave it open for them to decide, maybe they don't decide in your favor.
Exactly. I mean, I think there's a couple of things that we see pretty consistently. And so I would say, make 2 comments on what you just said. One is you need a really good CFO or CPA kind of behind the scenes with a chart of accounts that's consistent with MSPs in the industry. Your typical CPA is just going to take whatever you give them and apply it to tax. That doesn't mean it's ready for anything. That just means the IRS is okay, right? And the IRS doesn't really well, they do care how you account for things, but they don't really care that you have clarity. You can put all your revenue in one bucket, and the IRS doesn't really care as long as they know what your profit is and they can tax you on the profit. That's not really good business principles to operate the business on. So having a good CPA, having a good CFO or virtual CFO, there's a number of them out there. I highly recommend Thrive CFO. That's Bill Moore, who runs that company. Should be a part of MSP Initiative if he isn't, but should add him. He's a great expert, but he thoroughly understands the MSP space, can help you set up those chart of accounts, make sure it's tracked right so that you're tracking your gross margins correctly. That's probably one of the places that we see a lot. We've done work with the SBA as a part of transactions, and the SBA looks at that data and they're trying to figure out gross margins because the SBA has to have an evaluation done on your business to provide a loan, whether you're buying the company or not. And so because if we're the M&A advisor in the middle of that whole thing, we can actually do the valuation for the SBA because we're a biased party at that point. But aside from that, the point of that is a lot of the SBA, we've had conversations with valuators for the SBA who are trying to wrap their arms around the financials. And candidly, they really don't care what ConnectWise says. They don't care what service leadership says. They don't care what anybody else says. They have to see it in the files that they give in the financials. And if you're taking those financials out of QuickBooks and then manipulating them to be able to get to the data, it's almost disregarded because now you're manipulating data. So you really need to be able to have your QuickBooks in order, your financials in order, so that there's clear delineation between your revenue streams, your cost of goods associated with that revenue streams. You really need to have your labor that's directly responsible for delivery up in cost of goods, not in an overhead expense or an operating expense. There's a lot of disciplines along those lines that you really need, and you need to be consistent with it. That's the challenge that we see so much of it is people, for example, we're in the middle of a project right now where, hey, they had three main revenue lines. They had product, projects, recurring revenue. And they ran everything for about 15 years that way. And then in October of 21, they're like, hey, this doesn't give us good granularity and visibility. And so we're going to start doing it right. So we broke out recurring revenue by services, by BDR, by VoIP, and created a list of 9 different revenue streams that for cracking the data. Well, that's great. The challenge is that it's only about 16 months and they're not looking to sell, and they only have 16 months of that kind of data. And it's becoming this really big challenge to go, well, what was it before then? And so if you're looking at getting your business ready to sell, you really need to have 3 years of clean data. So it can be looked at 36 months, month over month, and be able to see the revenue streams, the gross margin by those revenue streams with good clarity. And it's not that people can't figure it out, but if I take that data and then have to manipulate it afterwards to get to the same answer, now that creates a whole lot of subjectivity and room for human error. And again, which is why I like the SBA. That it's like, hey, then you got to throw it out because we can't really treat that because we don't know that you're actually doing, the right thing with the data afterwards. So I'm belaboring a point, but it's a critical point because it shows up in just about every transaction that you have to have that. Those companies that have that done, though, clearly will get, it's not uncommon for them to get almost a full multiple higher, just because people can look at the data and go, oh my gosh, this is a full multiple higher. It's amazing. But that's because they can look at it and go, I clearly understand your business and it's clearly reported your financials. I know how you're making money. And quite candidly, for a buyer, especially if it's private equity backed, is going to be able to look at that and say, okay, now I know how to optimize it, because I can look at your financials and go, well, we're going to take out, these 3 things because we can consolidate you into what we're doing. And that's going to, produce a higher level of profitability. And as a result, we can afford to pay more as a result.
Wow. I mean, the fact that it's a full point higher at X, I call it higher. I mean, that's not a small number. I mean, yeah, it really isn't. Like
I would say it, yeah.
Let's say it's 5 versus 6X. I mean, that's noticeable.
That is noticeable.
Interesting. So,
and I would say the other piece, go ahead.
I was gonna say this would be something to do a workshop on, because I don't think, and here's the problem. Tell me if I'm wrong. The majority of business owners, hopefully they understand how profit and loss works and they know how to read a balance sheet, hopefully, but like they're outsourcing that work, right? Like they're not the ones in QuickBooks and Xero and whatever other accounting package you're using, Business Central. I mean, there's a few of them out there. They're not in there doing that work, right? They're handing that off. They're paying somebody else to do that. And like, they just hope that it's being done properly, but like, they don't understand that part of it is so important from a building block, foundational item, that it could affect, a big number like that.
Yeah. And that's really where you get to the value of being GAAP, right? Generally accepted accounting principles, and some of the stuff that we see people for tax purposes, I understand the game. So I'm not complaining about it, but it shows up in a transaction where it's like, well, we came to the end of the year, a bunch of revenue came in at the end of the year. Am I going to count that as 2022 revenue, or am I going to count that as 2023 revenue, right? And well, I don't want to pay taxes on it this year, so I'm going to count it as 2023 revenue, right? And so it slides forward, right? And there's nothing wrong with that from a tax perspective. You have the ability to be able to do that, but now however you account for it, whether you've pushed it or pulled it, now when you come to it and you come to a transaction, it's going to change your overall year-end performance, right? And again, we're in the middle of that where it's like, hey, they almost had $100,000 that could have swung either way. Here's the problem. They recognized the revenue in 2022, they recognized the cost in 2023. As a result, or excuse me, it was 2021 and 2022. As a result, their numbers in 2022 look pretty poor because of that $100,000 swing in revenue, which really should have been in a 2022 number, not a 2021 number, right? And so there's those kind of anomalies that you really got to look at, and you actually have to just map that out and be able to explain those numbers. But again, good GAAP compliance is going to solve a lot of that. And again, that's why a lot of especially the larger firms. But that's why a lot of the larger firms are getting higher multiples, because there is that consistency of accounting.
When you're in a position where you're trying to explain, like let's say you did play that game for a second, because I know a lot of people do that. That's just generally what happens at the end of the year. And you're like, hey, I paid for a whole bunch of stuff in 22 that actually were meant to hit in 23, right? Like I prepaid for stuff knowing that I needed it anyway. I had some money left over at the end. And so I just flushed it into prepaying for product, services, and things in the next year. Can you then, down the road, can you course correct that and explain and reattach that, or is that not generally allowed?
No, you can certainly do that. So, and this is where you're going to have a good CPA firm that's going to go through that and do a series of journal entries to be able to map that. So in the end, from a tax perspective, you're able to report it accurately for taxes, which is usually based on a cash basis, not on an accrual basis for most MSPs. But then but you run your business on an accrual basis, not on a cash basis. So as you go through that and you come to that year-end point, just going to be really important that you do have your CPA do the appropriate journal entries for your, what I'm going to call operating financials, which is how you run the business, and to be able to account for it says, yes, I prepaid for those things. And again, if you're following GAAP, you're going to be noting those on your balance sheet as prepaid expenses, and then you're going to be recognizing those expenses across the course of the next year. And so in the end, it's going to look super smooth and super efficient, and you're not going to have those kind of lumps that you would see if you're not following GAAP. And the vice versa, though. I mean, there's some legitimate things where, hey, we do realize that people pay for blocks of time, and they'll buy, hey, customers all the time do this. Like, hey, I've got a client who's got, an extra, $50,000 on their and in their budget, and they want to basically spend it this year so they can get to work next year because they don't want to lose it. And so hopefully I can write you a check for $50,000 and I can get, I don't know, 250 hours of work next year. And so they write you a check for that. Well, okay, that's great. Just take the business. You don't want to lose that, but you need to account for that correctly so that the revenue and the expenses show up in the same month that the work is actually being delivered. And so from that perspective, creates a much smoother financials. Either way that you're doing it, you can course correct. So if you do that and you didn't document it, there's ways within QuickBooks, there's ways within Dynamics or NetSuite, whatever you're using for your financials, that'll be able to track all of that data. And so when you actually do the reports for a prospective buyer or for the bank, all of that's going to be embedded in there and not something that somebody's doing, at the last minute to try to explain it.
I mean, I can't tell you how often this conversation isn't being had, but it is clearly important. I'm glad we're talking about it now. Let's go to another part real quick. I feel like people, and this is, where maybe the, understanding what other people are doing. And, I know we started off with, hey, this peer group concept, but how do you, I know some people have a hard time understanding if they have too many people, if they don't have enough people, if they're overpaying people based on the size of their business. There's something to that, right? When you're talking about overall health of the business, is there some sort of litmus test or calculator to determine where somebody should be based on their business when it comes to that category?
You're talking about like owner comp, or are you talking about just like
just
technical?
Do I have too many people? Am I overpaying for certain positions? Like that whole conversation.
Well, there's a couple of, I'm going to call it litmus tests, and then there's other good data sources, right? So as a litmus test, I'm going to tell you one of the first things I look at when I'm just having a conversation with somebody and I say, hey, so tell me about your business. They're like, oh yeah, great. We've been in business 20 years. We're, 4 million in revenue. Great. How many people you got? And if they say, well, we got 20 people, I know it's a pretty well-run organization. You have a employee to revenue ratio of 1 to 200,000, which is a healthy ratio, right? Top quartile firms are going to push about $220,000. Or top MSPs are going to push about $225,000 of revenue per employee. Underperformers are going to be like 100,000. If you're under $150,000 of revenue per employee, you're probably not making money. And so as a litmus test, it's a great way to go, hey, are they overstaffed? Are they understaffed? I know a lot of companies that use that litmus test to go, hey, if I'm operating between the kind of the 190,000 and the $220,000, of revenue per employee, I'm operating in a very healthy range. And as closer I get to 220, the more I go, hey, I need to add staff. The closer I get to that 180, 190 number, it's like, okay, I've either got to let staff go or I've got to really start to accelerate revenues to be able to get that up. So that's just, I would say, a great litmus test, operating dashboard number that provides some really good guidance. I think service leadership actually will provide some of the best data. I know that Taylor Business Group also has a salary report that they put out that takes a look, basically surveys all of their members and says, hey, this is what our members are paying for all these different levels on average, what top quartile service leadership will actually get into top quartile firms are paying kind of this much salaries for the different levels of technicians, salespeople, back office people. And you can also get some owner comp data. Owner comp data is a little rougher because it is subjective and owners can pay themselves kind of what they want to. But it does provide some good kind of ranges. So if you're a $4 million firm, as an example, as a $4 million firm kind of across the nation, excluding kind of Southern California and New York, I would expect on $4 million that an owner's going to be paying themselves somewhere around 150, 180, maybe 200,000. If I see 400,000, well, then that's fine. You can pay yourself that. You're probably picking up more tax than you want, and you should be doing it as a distribution. But it will provide some guidance for you along those lines around what other companies are doing. Obviously, the larger the firm, the larger the CEO comps tend to go with it. But service leadership has that data. Also, Taylor Business Group will have their annual salary reports, and that'll provide much more granular perspective.
Interesting. So I know a lot of people, and depending on which accountant or which CPA, right, coming back to owner compensation, right, there should be a certain amount of money you're taking as just an employee versus you just taking a distribution as an owner or principal of a business. And generally speaking, when it comes to the stuff that you're specialized in, there is always this conversation of, well, you didn't pay yourself enough, and if we had to replace you, this is what that would cost us. So you threw some numbers out there just now, right? How much money is reasonable for the person operating the business to take as a salary as an employee of the company versus taking the distribution as an owner?
Yeah, I think the best way there's two ways to answer that. Certainly coming into just operating the business, talk to your CPA. Most CPAs are going to generally tell you between 100 and 150,000, depending on the size of your business. Obviously, you're running a $500,000 in revenue shop, paying yourself, 150,000 may be challenging, as a salary. But as a general rule, if you're in that 2 to maybe 5 million, you're going to see kind of different levels, and you're going to take the rest as distribution. A lot of that's for tax purposes. When you start thinking about it in light of a transaction, you need to ask yourself, what is the level of income that I need to have post-transaction that I can live on? And that becomes a harder number because a lot of us who are owners get comfortable with, yeah, you're right, I'm paying myself, $150,000, but I'm the owner, so I get distributions, and I might pay myself another $150,000 in distributions for the year, and so my total income's 300,000. Pretty hard post-transaction to have unless you're 20 million in revenue, to have a $300,000 a year kind of salary, right? And so you need to, when we look at normalizing people's compensation for a valuation or for a transaction, it really is kind of, particularly around a transaction, is what is going to be your comp on a go-forward basis. And as you're pushing 10 million top line revenue, it's not uncommon to see $200,000 to $250,000 a year kind of salaries for that. But understand that once you have this transaction, your comp will not be distributions any further. There really aren't going to be any distributions because somebody else is going to be getting those distributions, basically the shareholders of the private equity firm, but you're going to be getting ordinary income based and bonus, right? And so there are measures on that. Again, both of those salary reports, the service leadership or Taylor Business Groups are going to lay that out and provide some context for it. But I would just generally say from a operating perspective, I see most people are paying themselves somewhere between $100,000 and $150,000 salary, and taking the rest as distributions.
Okay. See, these are actual tangible things, guys. Pay attention. And we're recording this, so you can go backwards and listen to this now, and then figure out if you're, accountant, CPA, CFO, virtual financial person, I don't know, pick a title that fits your situation best, is in line, right? Because I think it's important for you to understand what happens as an MSP or IT service provider versus just the general small business categorization, plumbers and lawyers and doctors. I mean, it's all different depending on, what kind of vertical that you live in, right? And I think that that's sometimes what confuses the issue, Reed, right? I think people almost have a surprise factor sometimes once
Right.
you're in the middle of something.
Well, yes, they certainly do. And that's where there's most people look at it and go, man, should I have a CFO? CFOs are really expensive. Am I really going to get anything different than a bookkeeper? A CFO is going to bring so much analysis and so much credibility to your organization. You will wish when you bring in a CFO that you'd done it earlier, right? Now, there is an expense factor to that, but there's a number of organizations like Thrive CFO, MSP CFO is another one where you can get virtual CFO type services that is going to bring a lot of that kind of analytics to your business and help you actually get good business information out of your financials, and is going to help make sure that your financials are in order and have that good history that you need, especially as you come into a transaction. And they'll be able to explain if you engage either one of those and you come into a place. So if you use a good outsourced CFO service, if you come to the place where you're going to do a transaction, or if you're going to go to the bank for to borrow money to get a loan to do an acquisition or an SBA 7A loan or something like that, they're going to have all of that financial data put in order, packaged really nicely, easy to understand, easy to be able to interpret. They're going to be able to explain your salary and your comps accordingly. That said, we do see from time to time, and again, I've had the SBA cringe. When you have a $5 million business and the owner or the CEO is paying themselves $50,000, it's like, okay, now you're really propping up your EBITDA with that low income, and and so it's not that that's by itself like, hey, that's really alarming. It's the fact that if you're doing that, what else are you doing? It really becomes the question. What else isn't being captured in your profitability, in your EBITDA, that's being kind of run through the business to kind of prop it up, try to make the business look more profitable than it really is. And so it's by itself is nothing. It's neither here nor there. It just is usually a leading indicator that there's more stuff hidden than you're going to want to find.
Well, let me flip it the other way for a second. So if you don't go out and bring in an equity-based partner in the business, you don't take the VC PE route, and the other route would be traditional bank, options, right? Loan, line of credit,
Yep.
something like that. Some people just take their money and just kind of dump it right back into the business as they are the, kind of investment source, right? So that does happen a lot, Reed. How do you account for that?
Well, I think you're not to oversimplify it. You just have to account for that, right? And you just have to be able to show what you're doing, what you're taking. Usually what's happening in that case is you're leaving cash on the balance sheet. And so you'll see, and this comes, yes, for a can of worms. This is that, gets into looking at working capital ratios, right? And so I'm going to take a look at what your current assets are divided by your current liabilities. Well, your assets can be money in the bank. And we see a lot of people that actually will kind of stash cash in the business. And so you'll have a higher than usual level of cash in the business. And we can see that through working capital ratios. As an example, I'm going to recommend, and I think a good CFO and CPA is going to recommend that you don't leave the cash in the business. Main reasons for it is if you do get audited, or if you do end up in a legal entanglement, that's something that lawyers can go after because it's money sitting there in the business. If you pull that money out of the business and you run the business leaner, you can pay it to yourself and leave it invest. You can always reinfuse that back into the business if necessary. But from an operating perspective, tend to encourage people to understand, hey, how much money do I really have to have in my business? And if I don't have to have it sitting there, it's better protection for you if you don't have it in the business, you have it in personal accounts, because in the end, God forbid, but if something happens and you end up in a ransomware attack, it's much harder to get money out of you personally than it is out of your business. If there's some sort of legal entanglement, then go after the business. In the end, if you have to, you can fold the business, protect yourself on a personal level if things really are catastrophic. And so anyways, it's not a scenario that anybody wants to have, but as a general rule, you're going to want to protect the cash. And that becomes the argument for having a holding company of as a wholly owned subsidiary. And so the profits actually roll from the subsidiary, which is the business you maybe run, into the holding company before getting distributed. And you can start to layer in protection, which is the second thing behind a good CFO, CPA that you need is good legal protection, having your ducks in order from a legal perspective. I know I've mentioned them before. Virtus Law does a great job. They can do a whole kind of legal review of your business, from your employee agreements to your customer agreements to your operating agreements, and make sure that you've got good legal protection to protect those assets that you've been building over the last 20 years.
Hey, Reed, I got a question here for you. What are some of the reasons why you would want to leave cash in the business?
The main reason why people will leave cash in the business is twofold. One, it can raise your tax basis. So any retained earnings that you leave in the business, you've already paid taxes on them. As a result, when I sell the business, if I have, example, if I sell the business for $5 million and I've got $1 million of retained earnings, that means I'm not taxed on the first $1 million because I've already technically paid tax on the first $1 million. In the end, it's a little bit of a shell game, because if you've paid that if you take that out of the business and paid it to yourself, from a tax perspective, not even gonna say you need to talk to your tax advisor for sure on this, but in the end, there's ways to create a tax shelter by leaving the money in it. Most people don't do that. The main reason why I see people leaving excess cash in the business, they have an aversion to taking on loans. And as a result, they're like, hey, why should I have a line of credit where I'm paying 4, 5, 6, 7% when I have cash that I could be using instead that's not being charged interest? I'm going to tell you, my opinion is this, that you're going to want to leverage lines of credit rather than cash facilities, predominantly because, especially in the situation where you have inflation taking effect, if your inflation rate is greater than your interest rate, then in that case, your money is actually, if you're using cash, you're actually losing money at the same rate as inflation. Where if I'm borrowing, let's say I'm using a line of credit at 7% and inflation is 8%, I'm actually have a delta of a 1% loss on the money that I'm using. That's presuming that I have my cash now invested in the business. So the challenge I see for most MSPs is they're leaving excess cash in the business. That cash is not producing anything for them. In other words, it's not giving them any sort of interest. And in the situation where we have high inflation today, that cash value is actually losing value at 8% right now per year. So you need to deploy it in some way to ideally make more than 8% interest on that, either through stock market or other investment vehicles. And I would definitely leverage lines of credit to cover the operating expenses of the business on a month-to-month basis.
I do have a question. I don't know why there's this, it always seems to be that people think they're out as selling their company. And George and I have discussed this before. I don't know why we don't spend more of our focus on investing our profits and our capital into retirement plans so that we can set up your company to live in perpetuity. And when you're retired, you could still get a Emirates type salary and get your retirement, and the company stays whole. And actually, I think if you're paying yourself what you deserve to be paid as a founder or owner, when you hire someone to replace you, it's probably half of the salary you're paying yourself. Look at how George lives, high on the hog.
I mean, as long as my Eagles season ticket invoice can be paid.
Yeah, but that's way on the third deck.
Yeah. Well, I would just, I love your question, Keith. I think the biggest challenge that people have is trying to find somebody actually that's going to run the business like you've run the business with the same heart for it that you've had for it, right? There's a lot of people that I know who have tried to find that, and it's really hard to bring in somebody from the outside who's actually show the same care, love and care that you've shown. The best way to be able to do that is actually be able to raise up the talent within your own business and transfer the business to that individual, or set them up where they have some sort of equity stake and a long run opportunity. I would say in most of those cases, I mean, that's the right way to do that. I would just tell you, having worked with a lot of customers, there's only about 10% of companies that can actually do that. And the vast majority, most owners haven't done a good job of raising up number twos, number threes behind it. The other thing is there is a real personality difference between what I call number ones and number twos. And I don't mean that like somebody's more valuable than the other. It just somebody who's comfortable with taking on the risk of operating a business, and realizing that hey, there's liabilities that'll go for it. Number twos who grow up in the business, I see time and time again, because we're part of it. We'll do valuations for somebody who wants to retire, kind of sell the business to their internal staff. And it's a great idea, but it really is only about 20% of the time where that staff, when they actually look at the risk of becoming the owner and what does that mean, and taking on the loan and what happens if they can't repay it, actually back out of it, because they're not the entrepreneur. They don't have the propensity to take on the risks associated with ownership. And so it is a struggle that a lot of MSPs struggle with. A lot of technology companies, parents owners will grow up the business hoping to pass to their kids, and their kids don't want to take on the business. And so what do you do when you have a business that's growing well and doing well, but you don't have an heir apparent, and it's much more difficult. In the end, quite candidly, it's easier to sell your business than to actually transfer it to your employees or turn it over to your children in a kind of a posterity scenario.
And the next question I had is, as you start, I know a lot of us, the data I see is based on income per employee. I think that there's a real way to make money by leveraging all the outsourcing you can do. Yeah. And allows you, one of the problems with employees, and nothing against employees because they're awesome, you have to hire them in half increments, right? If you want to grow, you have to be like a half ahead if you're in the growth mode. So you're overstaffed. That you don't have that problem as much with outsourcing, scaling your growth. And I think your leverage on income per outsourcing expense versus employee is much greater. And there's a lot of remedial stuff we can outsource, accounting, CPA, as you brought, first level help desk, that type of thing.
So I can answer that two ways. I mean, as you look at it, yes, I agree with you. I feel I'm a firm believer in, especially from an operations perspective, outsource what's not your core competence, right? If your core competence is in finance, then outsource finance to somebody who's going to be really competent at that. When it comes to a transaction, though, particularly like with, you can outsource, tier 1 support or help desk support. Most buyers today want to see that insourced rather than outsourced, unless they have great confidence in that outsource. So again, where we see it is if there's a reputable group that you've outsourced it to, like if you're outsourcing your help desk, tier 1, maybe tier 2 support, that's fine. But again, what we just see is that even though it may drive up profitability, as a result, most buyers are going to want to see that delivery of services done with your own team and not with an outsourced team.
Very interesting.
Yeah,
What about let's flip, because this will maybe help the Keith Nelsons of the world. What about IP valuation, right? I mean, if you're other than labor, right? We've talked a little bit about this in a past session or two, but like, what is the proper way to determine the value of the intellectual property build, if any exists?
Yeah, the value of the intellectual property is, what does it do for you? And you have to quantify that. So again, if you're looking at it, says, hey, I've built I have a client of ours that does that, but they're focused on 5 to 50 person law firms. As a result, 80% of the revenue comes from 5 to 50 person law firms. What they've built as a part of that focus is onboarding specifically for lawyers and attorneys, and they have a really clear checklist. That onboarding process, when they put it in place, reduced their onboarding by about 18%. Well, that's the value of that checklist, is 18% efficiency that was gained, and they were able to see how they reduced their cost by 18% by having that checklist and having that piece, right? And so that's just an example. They have a much more comprehensive set, what I would call intellectual property, but it's all built around that target market. And as a result, they can show what they were before they used that tool or the tools they built, the level of efficiency 1 year later by using those tools. And that becomes the value proposition of that intellectual property. Most people have have intellectual property, but they've never gone through the process of quantifying what that means. And so with that, it is an exercise, but you have to take a look at it and just to say, hey, what's the, when you think about it, in the end, that's what insurance does. So they're going to take a look at the risk and say, hey, how many times that situation actually occur and what are the costs associated with it? It's that same kind of mental analysis that you have to go through. It says, okay, I've built this tool, I've built this checklist, I've built this methodology. What is it actually doing for me? I need to track what it's doing for me from an efficiency man-hour perspective is usually where the easiest place to capture that data. We've reduced this by 5 man-hours as a result. Well, what's our average cost rate?
What about actual quantitative, not a process, but actual software? An actual solution that you invented that is on a long-term lease, has been used in fairly high-profile venue for over 20 years and constantly gets renewed every 5 years.
Yep. And so you're going to track it that way. I mean, I'm serious. I don't want to oversimplify it, but you're going to look at it and say, what is the value of that? Here's what it is. Here's what the revenues that's produced off it, or the revenue per contract. And you're going to be able to take that math and be able to show, hey, this is what we can do with it in the industry.
It's interesting, Reed. I'm sure somewhere along your journey, you've run into this where, inside of like an IT services or managed services company came out a new SaaS type offering, right? And then all of a sudden, the valuation of the SaaS is kind of viewed differently than normal service-based revenue, reoccurring project, all that other stuff that they sell, right? And like we've seen some MSPs or IT services companies get really crazy valuations based on a SaaS product that they've built.
Yes.
One that comes to mind is Electric out of New York, right? Have this really crazy $1 billion valuation. They're called an MSP, but in reality, they're valued as a software company.
Right.
So, like, I know that that's a very extreme example because that's one that's very noticeable and big, but a lot of MSPs have built cool tools. Some of them we've seen pop out as vendors in the sandbox, right?
Right.
And all of a sudden, like at what point do they have to understand whether that should be broken out into a separate entity versus underneath of one entity as an, managed services being the other part of what they do?
Yeah, certainly in the case where you have a software as a service, or I would say you're going to want to break that out sooner rather than later, because it will have a different value. And the value of that is much more market driven. I mean, to the conversation we've just been having, if I can show that here's what the total market, and so this is the other way of valuing intellectual property, but usually most people don't get to that. If I really have built a product that is kind of an off-the-shelf type item that I can layer in a subscription for, and I can show, hey, here's the revenues for it, here's the cost for it, here's the target market, here's how many customers that market could use that service, then the value of that intellectual property is much more market-based. That says, hey, we could grow this thing, and that's where those premiums are paid. For example, I had a client that built out a back office solution for the mental health care chemical dependency market. It was based here in the kind of the upper 5-state area. They got basically a 7x multiple on revenue because the buyer looked at that and said, wow, I can roll that out to all 50 states, right? And so when you looked at the opportunity, you were looking at the level of profitability. They were running about 35% EBITDA. As a result, they had spun that software as a service out into its own entity. They had a team that continued development. They had a sales team that would continue to drive it. As a result, it's not uncommon for us to see 5 to 7 times revenue for a software as a service firm. And in the end, they were able to sell that because the opportunity within the broader market outside of what they were able to deal with was material and significant. And as a result, the buyer came in and said, great, I've got a 50-person sales team. I can equip them with this and we can go sell this around the nation. And in the end, it was what they paid, even though it was millions and millions of dollars, was in value. I mean, they made huge money on it. The private equity company did as a result of it. So, I mean, there's ways to, again, what you're trying to do is you're trying to create value around it, what would be an intangible. And if it's buried within your systems, it's much harder to be able to identify the value of that intellectual property. If you're able to spin it off as a product or as a software as a service, even better, because that becomes easier. Even if it's not profitable today, if I can show a path to that profitability, if I can show the opportunity within the marketplace, I can see you can create a value around something that hasn't gotten there yet because of the opportunity that's there. And we do valuations on intellectual property. The harder ones is when it's pre-profit, pre-revenue, and then that gets really much more speculative.
Yeah, much more guessing at that point. I know you had made some predictions before we got to 2023. We're technically here now,
Yeah.
even though we're still writing 2022. And obviously we're so early on, like 5 days in, that like nothing's proven yet. But just in case anyone didn't hear your prior predictions, from a 2023 standpoint, where the market is going, in your opinion, is it going to be pretty steady, kind of another 2022, just change the number year? Do you see things slowing down, speeding up? I mean, obviously inflation hasn't stopped, seems to still be pretty, aggressive. And obviously interest rates, as a result, still going
Right.
up, and probably foreseeable is going to continue to go up. I find it interesting that you're like, well, hey, you got to make your money do something or else it's going to shrink with inflation. You go to the bank and the banks are offering CDs at 2%, 3%, just still way underneath of inflation, by the way. But I guess they're making money on top of that for sure. But that being said, like, zoom out, right? Let's say we're in January of 2024. What does 2023 look like for you?
I think for the technology space, I think the technology space is going to do relatively well compared to the overall market, right? So from a MSP perspective, I think your attrition is going to be consistent with your, not the attrition rates, but the reason for attrition is going to be very similar to what you've seen. You're going to have companies going out of business, kind of like you saw with COVID. You're going to have, whenever you have a down market, a lot of consolidation happens because there's companies that need to be sold and they'll be sold for under market values. That's not MSPs, that's going to be your end customers is what I'm going to be talking about there. So the attrition you're going to have, or that I would expect to see, is going to be consolidation and companies going out of business. I think as a technology industry providing MSP services, I think there's actually a pretty good opportunity to have a great year, right? There isn't any functioning business that can run their business today basically without infrastructure managed services. So from that perspective, I don't expect to see MSPs tank at all really in 2023. I expect them to be able to hold their own, but I think it is going to be a kind of separation of the chaff from the wheat, if I could put it that way. If you're a top quartile firm, we saw this during COVID. If you're a top quartile firm, you continue to grow. We saw companies grow at 10, 15% in 2020 as an MSP because they were flexible. They were able to adapt to the situation. If you were an average or underperformer firm, and this comes to some of the stuff that Pete was talking about with you earlier, Gary, hey, you're going to really struggle because then you don't have the room to be able to have a down year financially because you don't have enough financial vitality to be able to sustain that. And so I think you are going to see some MSPs, but I think it's going to be a small segment that are going to effectively go out of business because of a recession. That said, I anticipate the overall MSP industry to actually do pretty well, in no small part because of the concerns about cybersecurity and infrastructure security that are going to be out there. From an M&A perspective, I think the velocity is going to slow, but it was already really hot. And so I think when I say slow, I think it's going to go back to a bit more of a normal pace of transactions. We saw the multiples on valuations really up in the second half of 2021 and certainly carried through 2022. That was due in no small part to a shortage of sellers. As we come into 2023, I think that supply demand of a shortage of sellers is going to balance. Which is going to bring valuations back to more normal levels. And so if I were to compare where valuations, transaction values were, I'm going to separate valuations and transaction values because they're two different things. But if you look at transaction values pre-COVID in 2019, we thought it was a hot market. 2022, we saw them 1 to 2 turns higher. And a lot of that had to do with low cost of capital and supply demand issue. I think they're going to go back to that 2019 area. So I expect them to temper, but people are going to look at it and say, well, I used to get a 10x multiple. Now it's going to be an 8x. And you're like, yep, that's right. But it used to be an 8x, right? And so as much as you're going to feel like, hey, it's a pullback on the valuations, there really isn't. It's actually a returning to normal, kind of the bursting of the bubble that's been here over the last really kind of 16 months. That said, I don't think it's going to materially, I anticipate things to slow, but it's going to be a return to normal rather, and out of this frothy environment that we have, then I would call a pullback or some sort of major pullback from a valuation velocity or transaction value perspective. It's going to be a return to kind of historical norms.
So
I
if
think
you-
that aligns with what you're seeing with like companies like Amazon, who are announcing massive layoffs, which scares
Yep.
everyone on the surface. But if you dig down into that, you start looking at, they've reduced their speculation on the future. Maybe speculation is the right word. You know, part of their big layoff was what they thought was going to go with their sports entertainment group. And you see the same things with Microsoft and the big ones. They were kind of betting on the
Yep.
come a little over too much. And they're really not reducing to pre, and plus they were living off government money, which
Yep.
one other topic. But I think you're right. You see them really scaling back to where they were pre-free money, not really
Well,
scaling
I
back.
mean, Keith,
Yeah.
anyone who has, I don't know if it's publicly traded, venture PE funds, money, whatever. I haven't seen anyone in that situation, including the big ones that you're talking about, Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon, etc. At least 10% they've cut their workforce. That seems to be like the starting position across the board, or more for whatever reason, right? So, all of a sudden, the bean counters, shareholders, like people who actually care about the money, they're like, kind of need to start showing profitability all of a sudden instead of just burning, right? And so a lot of people
I looked closely. So, my kids work at Amazon, so I especially looked at that one. And they're really cutting speculative ventures, not core
Right.
competency. And I see that in Microsoft as well. I see them less willing to take a risk from the bean counter point of view, but to
Right.
focus more on their core competency. That's what I see. And I was looking for other opinions on that.
No, I would really agree with you on that. And as much as there's concern about what that could do from an unemployment perspective, and again, unfortunately, a lot of the unemployment numbers are at a macro level. I've read reports that they're expecting, unemployment to get back up into the 4.5%, 5%. From an industry perspective, I don't disagree with that. From a macro level, from an industry perspective, it's like, hey, we're dealing in the technology space with negative unemployment numbers. There's such a shortage of staff, and so as much as those bigger companies are going to be reducing staff, I think in some ways it's going to be somewhat refreshing for those of us at MSPs trying to find somebody that have been losing people. Because I've had a number of clients this year who's like, yep, and Microsoft offered my employee literally twice what I could afford to pay them and hired them away. And I just can't compete with that, right? It's almost refreshing to have Microsoft stopping and slowing that trend down, not overpaying, putting talent back into the market, basically, because I think it's going to be, from a technology perspective, I think it's going to be absorbed pretty quickly, and is not going to be. It's not going to. It feels alarming when we hear that. In the end, I think what we actually see pan out is going to be much less concerning.
I like that. That's good news. So there's a lot of information we packed in this one. I love how, as we begin to build understanding of what needs to be done across sometimes multiple people, right? And now we'll read, for example, is like a good repeat person that comes back, and we keep on kind of building on top of the knowledge here. This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to add value, people, right? We can talk at you, we're blue in the face. And, like me and Keith Nelson can talk about, NFC East football probably for hours. But that being said, no, we really appreciate, this is the type of stuff that really, I think, kind of creates the next level of understanding. I know on all the sports shows, like next level stats, right? Hey, next level understanding of how the market works and how your business is viewed. I mean, kind of helps you make good decisions. I think that's the idea. So stay tuned. We're going to have Reed back for more. Hopefully Reed will be able to join us for, remember, there's 2 in-person events we talked about when we started the show, which is a reminder, is in Dallas, May 8 and 9, and in Denver, August 14 and 15. We're calling this the MSP Community Minds event. We're bringing in experts from all over the industry into hopefully one place where you can kind of get the best of all worlds, right? And so this is the type of stuff that we're trying to do, and hopefully we'll continue doing that throughout the rest of the year. Reed, we'll be in touch, my friend.
Thank you, sir.
And don't you better call your buddy Dave Scott. He's a little overhyped
Okay.
on Vikings. Okay. Tell him to calm down.
It's all hype, man, because it's never turned into anything. So I'm going to stop right there.
I
All right.
know.
Great.
I try and stir him up a little bit. That's all. I just keep him going. But anyway, this session was recorded. You'll find this under the sessions tab of mspinitiative.com. Everyone, thanks for joining us. Reed, thanks for joining us again. We'll catch you Tuesdays, Thursdays, 1 o'clock Eastern time, or hopefully in person sometime later on this year. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good one.
Take care.